welcome to the first episode of the Noise Not Music podcast. My name's Jack.
And I'm Caden.
And today we are going to be talking about and deconstructing the origins of noise music. And we've got some topics lined up that will hopefully provide a easy to understand but also somewhat in-depth analysis of this genre that I know Caden and I both appreciate greatly.
Yeah,
And,
so we're just gonna be going over some classic artists and albums, as well as talking about just some of the philosophies and ideas and all that behind these albums, and also talk about how you yourself could get into some early noise.
How admirable.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we are going to start with the obvious choice, which is Luigi Russo Low. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's going to be rough in that department. There are a lot of hard to pronounce things.
Yeah, we'll try.
But what was that? It was 1913 that he wrote The Art of Noises.
Somewhere around there. Yeah.
And kind of separated them into categories, just like scraping and rustling and things like that.
Right. So I think his general idea was like orchestral music and, classical music at the time was just too limited in its sound palette. He was just using violins and pianos and, all these specific sounds. And he was like, why not just, open this up to a whole new range of all the different sounds that you can have. And so, yeah, that was kind of his idea. We listened to a compilation of his stuff, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because it is in a language that I do not want to try and pronounce. So, but yeah, it's I believe it's from 2000 maybe that it was kind of made, but all the material is from like the 20s basically.
Yeah, and they just like I saw I guess the cover was like a really old photograph of his setup, and it looked like a mad scientist lab or something. He had like giant like gramophone horns everywhere and just a bunch of like metal objects. And
yeah, so he basically invented his own instruments, right? I forget what they were called, but they were just like these strange boxes, these kind of contraptions that made all these rumbly, scrapey kind of noises. And so that's kind of what he built a lot of his music out of.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about because, people say noise now, especially as just a term to classify weird stuff. I feel like that's the go-to term for most people to, like, when they just hear something that they just say it just sounds like noise. And I know that if theoretically Luigi Russo Low was come out with that album today, I don't think people who were trying to be more specific would really call it noise.
Yeah, it's kind of the interesting thing. It's like, there's noise, but then there's also like musique concrète and field recordings, and there's ambient, and there's all these other genres that can sort of overlap, but nowadays we make distinctions between the different styles of experimental abstract kind of music.
Yeah, and I felt that I think the retrospective term for what Russo Low was doing is futurism. I'm not really sure what that means, but in my mind it bore a lot of similarity to like modern sound art stuff, people dealing with the textures and timbres of sounds of objects that typically aren't used for music. And it's like it's hard to draw the line like where noise begins and other stuff ends. And I think at least, well, it probably started in the early 80s was this confrontational approach to it.
Yeah.
And like
we'll get
a
to
less
that,
academic. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's
I
interesting
don't want to
that
jump ahead, but I'm just trying to
right.
deal with the semantics of it.
It's interesting how there's like such a separation between high art and low art in like experimental music, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you have like the people who have like these museum installations and all these like, concepts behind their work, and then you have people that are just like banging on random objects and just like screaming and going crazy. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, the separation there.
So what's next on the chronology that you have listed out?
I was just going to mention that futurism, I think, is part of sort of like the Dada art movement. And Luigi Russo Low was actually like a visual artist more so than a musician. This is just sort of like a side thing he did. But so yeah, noise is very much born out of the Dada movement. And that would actually go on to inspire people like Merzbow later on. But anyway, so the next artist I have to talk about here is John Cage. I admittedly haven't heard too much by him, but his general, theories and kind of approach to music was very influential to a lot of noise artists all across the board. So
not only his approach to music, but also his approach to like classifying music and challenging that classification of music. Like on a theoretical level, I feel like a lot of people appreciate him for that more so than his actual music, which is sort of hard to listen to, I think.
Actually, sorry to jump back to Luigi Russo Low, but we didn't really talk about like what the music actually sounds like. I mean, do you want to kind of talk about what you liked and didn't like about the actual like music itself on that compilation?
Yeah, it's just sort of that thing where I personally I can appreciate it, but it's not something that I would listen to and go back to for pure visceral enjoyment. It's just kind of like, as you said, rumblings, and sort of just sounds like he's trying out different things, and
yeah, I mean,
it's like kind of oddly like amateurish for
yeah, it really does sound like he's
stature.
He's more just like experimenting rather than like
exactly
doing actual compositions per se. But what I found interesting about a couple of the tracks, like towards the second half, was like, I guess the ones credited to both Luigi and Antonio Russo Low, was that they were sort of like somewhat normal like orchestral compositions, but then they had his noise instruments like worked in, so you just have these kind of like lo-fi violins and whatnot just playing pretty conventional melodies, but in the background you have all this like rumbling and kind of, I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, the recording quality is pretty primitive because it was like straight on the wax, but
yeah,
some really interesting stuff. I wish that, I guess I can't really speak for anything that's out there because I haven't looked for it, but stuff with better recording quality that uses both standard orchestral instrumentation and non-standard instrumentation.
Yeah, I haven't heard too much like that. All right, so we can go back to John Cage now if you want. So I guess we want to talk about his composition 433, which I've heard just like so many different noise artists say that's what inspired them. So
really,
yeah, I can't think of any particular ones right now, but I know I've heard it mentioned multiple times. Just the idea that like so for those of you who don't know, 433 is basically a silent composition where the performer goes up on stage and just kind of sits at the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, doesn't really do anything. And the idea is for the audience to listen to the sounds around them rather than, the sounds of the piano. And so you just kind of take into account your whole sonic environment, and that's the piece. So I think the idea of just like any sound can be musical or artistic was kind of like brought up by that, that composition. And so I think that's very, very influential to a lot of, noise musicians.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty hilarious reading about like the setting in which that was first introduced. I think David Tudor was the first one to perform it, and it was like in this concert hall, a bunch of people dressed up in suits, and he just walked out there, just sat at the piano, opened and closed the top a few times, and then walked out.
Yeah, it must have honestly been pretty hard to perform, just in the sense that like it must be so awkward because everyone's just like looking at you and being like,
everyone's just like waiting for you to do something, and
yeah,
and it's weird because it actually it seems like a very informal composition, but it has 3 movements, and it's pretty much just like any other composition except that it has no notes
yeah,
or very minimal action whatsoever.
yeah.
And I know he said later that, because it's often kind of misconstrued, it's known as the silent composition for obvious reasons, but the main reason he made it silent, silent as in the performer isn't making any sound on purpose, was to call attention to the noises that were happening around, the non-diegetic sound, if you will. And he said like during the performance, you could hear like people like creaking in their seats, and like a plane passed overhead, and you could hear like all these sounds that you wouldn't hear if a full orchestra had been playing a normal composition.
Right. It also kind of, I guess now I'm thinking about it, sort of pioneered the idea of field recordings as like a finished product of, music. Just in the sense
field recordings and indeterminacy as an approach to composition. Letting Cage was big on that. Letting chance be an element, and sort of either organizing that uncertainty or kind of leaving it as a force of its own.
Right.
And obviously, like no 2 performances of 4 minutes 33 seconds have ever been the same.
Right.
For that reason.
And no 2 performances of really any noise music is going to be the same, because, even if you try to do it exactly this, like, there's so many different things that happen, and it's often improvisational that, it's always going to be different every time.
Yeah, and I know Cage was big into chance, and like it's crazy the range of uncertainty you work with. I just watched a documentary about the Mattress Factory. I don't know how close to Pittsburgh you live, but it's there, and it's a non-standard art museum that's focused on installation and site-specific art. And he did one there where for 105 days, all the objects in the moon, on the moon, what am I saying? All the objects in the room were to be rearranged based on like a random number generation system that he created. And then you have stuff like 44 minutes 33 seconds where there's absolutely nothing dictating the randomness, and it's just kind of whatever happens in the environment. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and like I feel like neither of us are experts on Cage, especially not the music itself. I can't say I very often listen to recordings of 4 minutes 33 seconds, or I have heard his some of his stuff that he did with radios, where he just like had a bunch of radios tuned to different things, which is obviously indeterminate because you can't really pick up the same radio signals and at different times. All right, what do we got next? Triple M? Or is it a Dub Taylor thing?
Yeah, so yeah, I have Dub Taylor next. Yeah, you found this album.
Yeah, Lumiere, I believe is how it's pronounced.
Yeah. So this is just kind of a random one-off album. He didn't seem to make anything else after this. But yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A lot of that, the academic approach to musique concrète pioneered by Pierre Schaeffer, and that's a really, really American way to say that name, but that's what you're gonna
Yeah.
get. And I feel like this Dub Taylor thing kind of had that academic atmosphere to it, but it was also very unruly and kind of noisy in the sense of how we look at noise today.
Yeah.
And I found it really interesting and enjoyable in that regard.
Yeah, it was interesting how much sampling was used in that. I don't think sampling was really like that big of a thing back in this is like 72 that it was made. But he used a lot of samples from I noticed a lot of it was from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I watched pretty
Oh,
recently.
really?
So there was like the
I
robot
didn't
howl.
I didn't even pick up on that.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah, I know that there was some really primitive um, sound collage work going on around that time.
mhm.
But I don't think anything was super formal yet. So interesting that such a one-off album was pretty visionary in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was basically, all these collages of people saying things and then sort of synthesizer noodling kind of over top. Um, yeah, just kind of messing around with synthesizers and making a bunch of bloopity bloop kind of tones with that. So,
Yeah, and it got pretty like chunky and distorted at times too, which were
yeah,
my favorite parts.
yeah, for sure.
Very very mechanical, and it was like I know I was mentioning how it's sort of like in that academic context, but has a very visceral impact on the listener. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
depending on if you appreciate that kind of stuff or not.
It does seem sort of like a bridge between the academic and more, yeah, I guess low art
Yeah,
type of approach.
low art. What a
Uh,
flattering
I
name.
don't know, I don't know how else to say it, but
No, I get you.
yeah. I like the parts. I didn't really love it overall. Just because, I mean, it was really impressive for the time. But like, if that was released nowadays, it's just the sounds with the synths and all that are kind of, uh, I don't know, they're not too advanced, I guess.
Yeah, pretty
So
primitive for
yeah.
sure.
But I like some of the parts when like some of the parts were almost a bit ominous to me. Especially when he was using samples from 2001 and like you had the Hal robot going like what's his line from that movie? Have you seen 2001?
No, but I know a lot about the house stuff.
Yeah, it's like, I'm afraid I cannot do that, Dave. It's just
Yeah,
like
and the song he sings in that movie, I think was the first song ever sung by a robot, like
yeah, I noticed
in
that
real
because
life.
I had actually watched that video before I watched 2001 and I was like, hey, that's that song. So yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, so this is where we transition from noise music into talking about Kubrick movies. um, hope you hope you anticipated that.
Yeah, well, there's some pretty. I feel like we should talk about the Eraserhead soundtracks at some point. Have you seen
Oh
that movie?
man,
That's like,
no, but I have heard the soundtrack.
yeah,
Some crazy stuff.
it's like one of the first dark ambient things. But anyway,
And then what we got next? We got Mainstream Invasion with Triple M, right?
yeah. So Lou Reed, Metal Machine Music. It's the first time anything that's related to noise music got super super popular, or maybe infamous.
Well, I mean, popular only in that it was released on a major label, right? I don't think
Well,
people heard it and were like telling their friends, "You got to hear this shit." But
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's infamous rather than famous. It's, it got a lot of attention, but most of it was negative because, audiences that were fans of Lou Reed were not expecting something like that.
yeah, and it's kind of a different thing in that it wasn't like really a passion project for him. I mean, I can't really speak for Mr. Reed, but he was basically I don't know the full story, but he was kind of pissed off at the label, right, and just wanted to
Yeah,
make an album that'd be impossible to sell or whatever, and so he just recorded an hour of like crazy guitar distortion and like it's crazy, like the fact that came out on such a large record label.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'm not sure if it's even confirmed what his sort of motivation behind that was, but
yeah, I don't know,
I mean, this might be just speculation.
because I know
I don't know.
at least in the Velvet Underground, Kale was always like the driving force behind their adventurousness and their avant-garde tendencies. So
Yeah, I actually found a Velvet Underground track from like I don't know, I think it's like the early '60s. That was
oh
basically
yeah, is that
just a
that
noise
split
track.
that they did
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the other guy?
I don't
Yeah, I've
remember
heard
who the
that.
other
It's
guy
some
was,
pretty
but
cool stuff.
yeah. So I mean, that's pretty impressive.
And
Way back then.
they also did that Symphony of Sound thing.
I don't know if I've heard that. But
Yeah, you should. I don't know if the video is on YouTube, but I think the full thing is, and it's just a very free, improvisational, noisy jam that ends with like the cops getting called on them.
well, yeah. So
Well, yeah, I mean,
metal,
I
metal
can't
machine
imagine
music.
picking up the new Lou Reed album, having just heard like what was the one before that? I know Transformer was 73.
I haven't actually listened to
And-
his other stuff, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, just like I mean, it's just him on the cover and it just says Metal Machine Music.
Yeah.
And like I wouldn't pick that up thinking it was actually Metal Machine Music. I just thought it'd be another Lou Reed album, and then playing it in the car on the way home. Well, I guess they couldn't play it in the car, but
Yeah, well, get the idea.
they didn't have car turntables back then.
That'd be cool. Yeah, I listened to it pretty recently, and I mean, I don't know, it wasn't quite what I expected. It was actually like somewhat pleasant by noise standards, I guess. Like some parts were almost kind of melodic and harmonic, and like I don't know, there's just some cool like guitar tones and stuff. I mean, it's very samey throughout, but I don't think it gets like too grating really.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So
It's not. I think its reputation stems from the fact that it came out on that label rather than it being actually a super abrasive, like out there album.
yeah, well,
I mean,
that's,
of course, relatively, it was, but
yeah,
not the craziest thing.
that's why like I was expecting it to be like just really like. I mean, I guess it wasn't too much effort, but I don't know. I wasn't expecting it to be very good, but I actually kind of enjoyed it, so I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And
So,
I think
yeah.
that that's kind of what I tried to mention earlier, but kind of backed off of to avoid jumping the gun, was that confrontational approach, the kind of I'm going to make noise because I want to piss people off, or I don't want to make art, I want to make sound, and just kind of putting those sounds all together
Right.
for reasons other than wanting to make the art.
Yeah. Less of like a academic conceptual approach and more of just like
Yeah, definitely.
brutal aggression kind of stuff. So, yeah.
What we got next? So,
so-
New Blockaders were around then, right?
Yeah. So I listened to Change Le Bloqueur, or however you pronounce that. I believe their first album from '82. I heard you don't like that album. Is that true?
I'm not a big fan. No.
Yeah.
It's another one of those things where I kind of question it being called noise, because there's not much. I mean, it's noisy, obviously. It's just them, like, it's just like metal scraping together and like bashing stuff for 46 minutes, but it's not really, it's definitely not noise in the modern sense, or the sense that we use it in today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
None of it's manipulated or put through effects or anything.
Right. There's really no like electronics involved. It's just kind of it's sort of just like free improvisation, but with like
and the haters are the haters are the same way mostly. I mean, they had some tape manipulations that they did and things like that, but it was mostly just the performance aspect of it. And I know the New Blockaders, to connect back to what we were talking about earlier. I don't know if they've said this or people kind of connected on their own, but they took inspiration from Luigi Russo's manifesto, The Art of Noises, and kind of classify their music, for lack of a better word, into like one of his categories that he put sounds into.
Yeah, and also like the Dada movement in general is very, very much a part of their sort of aesthetic and art style. So.
Yeah, and them and the haters, and I'm trying to think of who else would fit in that category, but they most certainly fit into the confrontational, even nihilistic paradigm behind noise. And
yeah, I'd say Merzbow as well early on.
Yeah. They have a cassette. I think it's called Symphony in Null Minor. I'm not sure. It's like it's the 0 with the slash through it. I'm not sure how it's pronounced audibly, but it is just a blank cassette that they distributed as an album.
Right. They kind of pioneered the whole anti-record thing, right?
Yeah.
Like just having a record that's completely destroyed and unplayable. So.
Yeah, I know. I can't remember who it was, but someone had a tape where it's played by rubbing dirt in it, and then the Garo Garo Gay Gay Gays album that was just a box of cassettes that you had to shake together. So, yeah, obviously it's, I don't know if it's really meant to be taken seriously, or it's just, it's just for the sake of doing it. Like,
yeah, I think with that kind of stuff, it's just
New Blockaders' whole thing was like, we don't make art. It's not art. It's just, I don't know. They're very edgy.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the anti-record type stuff, it's like, sort of like we're totally redefining music. So let's also redefine like the way people listen to music, I guess. And so like the actual medium itself gets modified. I don't know.
Yeah, and they kind of modified the performance aspect of music too. The only way you would know where a hater's performance started or ended was like the specific tape loop that they would play. And it could be like 5 seconds, or it could be half an hour, or even longer. And it's just them on stage smashing a bunch of shit.
Yeah, I read the Wikipedia article on the haters, and they said that like initially it wasn't even really about like sound. It was more just about kind of the performance of like destroying things.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they eventually just added sound because, I don't know, they needed a way to keep track of time or whatever.
It's crazy to me that we listen to this stuff because, I mean, you listen to a haters album. I've only really heard what's that? What I think it was the first LP they ever put out.
In the Shade of Fire.
Yeah.
I listened to that,
and I like that one a lot. And I mean, it's literally just them smashing shit. And like I was talking about how I don't like the New Blockaders one for that same reason, but I don't know. It's pretty dynamic, and the stereo space is unique, and you got like interplay between the two channels, kind of stuff going back and forth, and I don't know. It's got a ugly lushness to it that I really like.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think I actually like the original New Blockaders album a little bit more than the In the Shade of Fire Haters one. It's sort of the same idea of just like repeating the same kind of sounds over and over, just like constantly throughout the track. But like, I don't know, the New Blockaders one just has a bit more variety and leaves you a bit of space to breathe. Something that I picked up about the Haters album is like it's essentially like Harsh Noise Wall almost. Like there's it's just the same sound continually throughout the whole track. So it's sort of like pioneering that whole genre. You know?
Interesting. That's interestingly enough, that's kind of the gripe I have with. How do you pronounce that thing? Changer les bloqueurs or whatever.
Just say change the blockaders because I think that's what it means.
But it's just like the segmentation of it and like the weird like stop and start and stop and start. It just kind of rubs me the wrong way, I guess.
Yeah, I can see that.
Whereas I love that kind of like constant assault.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
I think John Weiss has written about the Haters, or his record label like published a book about it or something. I'll have to find more information about that, but I saw it on one of his pamphlets that he sent me.
Oh, cool. Yeah, like I mean, In the Shade of Fire, it really does have pretty cool sounds. Like I feel like the sound design on that album is pretty neat. Like, because it's not just like distortion. Yeah. It's not just like, we took recordings and we just put a bunch of distortion on it. It's like these weird other effects that just make it this kind of mid-rangey, kind of whooshy sound. So it's pretty texturally interesting, I guess.
I would agree with that. And that in itself is interesting because I don't think in their philosophy they're particularly interested in exploring specific timbres of the objects they were smashing. I think they just wanted to smash them.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It ended up having a different result.
Yeah, it almost sounded like they didn't even care about their sound, but I mean they had to a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, and art is such a bizarre thing in that regard because you can have a purpose behind the final product that you put out, and that can be the entire embodying explanation for it, but people can experience it or listen to it or look at it and get something completely different.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's just kind of how it works, because that is the ultimate variable that you cannot control, is the experience of the person who experiences it.
Mm-hmm. Especially with stuff like noise, where it's just totally abstract. I think everyone has a different taste in noise and a different reason for listening to it, and a different thing they get out of it, kind of. So.
Yeah, and I've always been kind of annoyed by people who kind of look down on stuff because of how it was made. Like it didn't take a lot of effort. Like it's just him like just smashing shit. Like he didn't put any effort into it. Like, why are you? I'm talking specifically about the Sissy Spacek track, Really Into the Haters, because I've told people how much I love that song, and
that
their
track
complaint
is great.
Wasn't that the song itself was stuff smashing. It was to make it, the guy smashed stuff, and like, why would you listen to something that took no musical talent? And I'm like, I mean, why do you listen to anything? Because you enjoy it. Like, I don't like enjoy something and then think, oh, well, they didn't put any effort into it, so I guess I shouldn't enjoy it. Like, I enjoy the song ultimately, so I don't really care what went into it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the majority of people who just listen to like, surface level kind of music, just like mainstream radio pop or whatever, like, they don't care about how it was made. Like the artist that's singing or whatever probably didn't do too much to create the whole instrumental or whatever, but like they don't care. It's just like they like the song, that's all that matters. So,
yeah. I mean, I am one of those people, so be careful there, mister.
What do you mean? Like, what kind of people? You like pop music?
What?
Are you saying you like
pop music? I like a lot of mainstream pop.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I like too much mainstream pop, but I do like pop in general sometimes, so.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Um, all right, and then we got the head honcho of noise, the
Yeah,
the guy everyone's always talking about, Mr. Masami Akita.
aka Merzbow. So, have you heard? I don't know. Like, what kind of early stuff have you heard from him? Like early '80s material.
Um, I'm not super familiar with. I know I've heard a lot of his analog stuff, like the um like before he went digital.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what specific time that was, but
I listened
I
to.
definitely I would say I like that stuff more overall
Yeah,
when he was using pedals and tapes and things like that.
yeah. I listened to a couple, one from '82 and one from '83, just like to prep for this podcast. So one of them was Material Action for two microphones, and the other was Mechanization Takes Command. And I like both of them like better than really anything else I've heard from Merzbow. Uh, just I don't know that they're a lot more interesting. There's a lot of different sounds, a lot of different textures and stuff. And I feel like he's just working with a lot of different instruments and found objects and whatnot. But they're really interesting listens.
I've always wondered if the reason that he's always the go-to for noise music is because of the music itself, or I feel like he sort of embodies the noise aesthetic. I mean, I really kind of hate the overuse of aesthetic nowadays, but it's kind of what I mean here is that, super prolific, very, I don't know. I'm also not a fan of the word nihilistic, but that's sort of his thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's I feel like he's kind of the intersection of all of that, because it's very some of his stuff is very intellectual, just him sitting at a computer, but it's also very visceral and confrontational, and he kind of embodies all that, all
Yeah,
those elements.
I think there's like a bit of a juxtaposition with his live shows because like, you know, live he's just kind of like standing there calmly, just like turning knobs and stuff. Like a lot of noise artists just freak out and are super hyper and energetic during the live performances, but he's very calm and collected. But then the actual sound is very violent and loud and
Yeah.
all that.
In contrast with someone like Masana or
Mm-hmm.
more
Like
more
Purient or
physical
something.
performers.
Yeah.
I know he's definitely very different from a lot of the other Japanese noise artists who kind of came about. Because like he started like early '80s and worked throughout most of the '80s,
Mm-hmm.
and then the whole Japanoise thing wasn't really. I mean, and then Hanada Ash in the mid '80s or whatever. But then like the whole Japanoise thing didn't start gaining steam until the '90s. So it's pretty crazy that he was really the only one for that amount of time.
Yeah. I think Hijo Kaiden, is that how you pronounce that? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Okay.
Oh
I
yeah,
think,
they were around then too. They formed in
they
like
started in
'79, I
like
think.
yeah.
That's a good point.
I found something from them from '81, I think, and it was just like it was really obnoxious. It was just like this high pitched kind of feedback thing that was just kind of glitching out, and it was just like the same thing throughout like 20 minutes. And something I
Yeah, well,
noticed
a lot of their stuff is like that.
yeah, I mean, it's something I noticed with a lot of these early noise artists is like a lot of them kind of take the same like palette of sounds and just like continue it in a really like monotonous and repetitive style throughout the whole like an entire track or an entire album. it's kind of interesting that like so many people took that approach early on, like not too much variation, just like really focusing in on a certain like texture, you know.
Yeah. Whereas, I feel like Hanatarash was more of the performance art aspect, like similar to the Haters. I want to say probably more extreme. You can't really get more extreme than driving a bulldozer through the venue and destroying the stage during a performance. But that's a pretty infamous incident. But and it's interesting to see the disconnect between like the things someone records and their performances, because I mean you listen to Hanatarash and it's obviously very, very physical and a lot of, object work and things smashing together. But then people like Incapacitants, which is Toshiji Mikawa from Hijou Kaiden, and then another guy whose name I can never remember, but all their recordings are very long and monotonous and almost wall noisy. And then their performances are sometimes be like a few minutes of them just like making the loudest noise possible and then just like smashing their pedals until something disconnects and all the sound cuts out.
Yeah, I haven't seen too many of their live performance videos. I should look up them.
Yeah, they're I think it was they played at some festival in America, and I want to say it was No Fun Fest. But that's a pretty infamous one. I read a book about Japanoise that I think you would really enjoy. It's free for download on the guy who wrote it's website, but I kind of talked about that.
Okay, you should send me a link.
All right, I feel like that's coming right up to the era in which noise music was really starting to gain steam worldwide.
Yeah, probably. Well, do you want to move on from, talking about specific artists and just get into sort of a general discussion of like why we enjoy noise music and sort of how maybe we could recommend other people approach it?
Yeah, sure. It's noise, and especially wall noise it's usually very hard for me to justify to people why I enjoy it so much, because it's just raw, and I keep using the word visceral, but really there's no way else to describe it. I mean, you just appreciate it on such a primal level. It really is hard to describe in words why you like it, because you just kind of feel it, At least that's how it is for me. And that's why I like going to shows and things like that, because you just feel it and it's the experience. And
yeah, I think that's definitely the case for more modern noise, but I feel like the early noise stuff, like most of what we talked about here, isn't so much like primal and visceral. It's more just about sort of, I guess, sound exploration and just sort of concocting strange soundscapes out of, various different textures. So I guess with that, it's more of just if you just have an appreciation for sound in general, and you can sort of expand your idea of what music can be. It doesn't have to have a beat in the melody. You can just hear different sounds and appreciate, how all these different sounds kind of work together to create this interesting kind of tapestry. So,
yeah, for sure. I do agree with you there, and I've always been one to take things at surface level and describe things based on how I experience it, rather than try to guess at what the artist was trying to accomplish, because it's always kind of a gray area there.
Yeah.
And with such conceptual heady music like that, like this, especially with Cage and things that aren't specifically designed to be enjoyed at the end, but rather to call attention to their identity and how they were made. It's sort of difficult. But then again, there is stuff like that where I just legitimately like to listen to it, regardless of what philosophy was put into it or anything like that. And that's ultimately my personal criteria, is even if something is super interesting conceptually and I can appreciate it in that way, it doesn't mean I'm going to say that I enjoy it as music.
Right. Yeah. I think you just really have to gain a taste for just enjoying different sounds. And I think a lot of more modern noise music that's more just like distortion constantly and that sort of thing. Like, I just enjoy, I mean, there is the whole visceral kind of blood pumping, I guess, side of things that you can enjoy it on that level. But, you know, maybe at a quieter volume, you can also just enjoy the sort of crunchy, rumbly sound of just distortion. Like, it's just kind of an interesting sound if you approach it in that way, and it can just be kind of pleasant in a weird way. So
I totally agree.
yeah.
Yeah, and I another thing I get asked a lot is, you know, how did you come to appreciate noise? And I don't really remember necessarily. I think I watched one of my favorite movies ever is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the soundtrack to that is amazing. I think the director and some other guy made it, and it's very industrial and like metal scraping and very ominous news clips and things like that. And I love that thing. I listened to it when I was a kid all the time. And then I sort of found through the internet that there was this thing called noise, and started to listen to stuff that would belong in that category. And it's less that you're excuse me, it's less that you're breaking down your tolerance and like letting yourself listen to stuff that's worse and worse, which is what people usually try to tell me has happened. Instead, it's just that you're, I don't know, broadening your appreciation for things that aren't as direct and sounds that aren't as easy to process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not like you can just put any sounds together and it'll just, you know, either of us could appreciate it. Like, you know, certain sounds don't sound good together. And I don't know, I think there's some stuff that, some combinations of frequencies and whatnot that really no one can appreciate. But something about noise and the way that most noise artists kind of construct their work is just makes for stuff that's very just, I don't know, just very nice to listen to in different contexts for whatever reason.
For sure. And then you wanted to provide some specific albums that people could listen to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've already talked about some albums, but do you have any others in this kind of early style that you think would work?
I was thinking, one, I don't really know much specific about Cage, but David Tudor has an album called, or a composition called The Rainforest, which is really interesting, and I think it's kind of important in this context. And also, I want to reiterate that Velvet Underground album, I think it's called A Symphony of Sound, is an interesting one to listen to. And then I had one more in mind. Oh yeah, I just want to say that I really like a lot of the New Blockaders' other albums, just not the first one.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's funny because they very diverse body of work. My favorite thing by them is, I never know how to pronounce it, but it's like Live in Hinoima. Super colorful, dynamic, like shifting noise. And that's the kind of stuff I like, rather than, you know, just mechanical shifting and smashing and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as albums I'd recommend to get into it, I mean, I think if you're into classical music, then the Luigi Russo Low stuff that's sort of combining orchestral music with his noise machines would be probably a good starting point because it's just complete blending of those two styles. And yeah, I mean, again, if you're into classical music, John Cage was originally a classical composer, and you could follow his kind of progression into all this nonsense. And I don't know if there's too much like really early noise stuff that is like a good entry point, really. I don't know. Like a lot of it was
Yeah,
just
especially in this area, it's hard to
Yeah.
it's hard to give an album that you can just go right in with. Because
Right.
I know personally, I worked backward rather than forward. But I mean, even if you don't like the music itself, I know a lot of people that I've showed it, you can just appreciate the conceptual factors and the philosophy behind it.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, how I basically got into noise is, I mean, I was just interested in electronic music. That's kind of all I listened to a few years ago, and I just started listening to more and more experimental electronic stuff. So like, I got into like Aphex Twin or whatever, and then it just kind of Tim Hecker, and then artists that started incorporating elements of noise, and then I eventually discovered people like Merzbow and like Prurient, and at first I was just more interested by it rather than actually enjoying it. But I think that's the first step. Like if you're interested in it and you find it like really weird and cool, then I don't think you should just say like, well, it's interesting, but I don't think I could actually enjoy that. Like just keep listening to more of it if you're interested by it, and eventually you'll start to probably develop an actual taste for it. So
yeah, that's a good point. I feel like that's always kind of been because you have to have a desire to get into something, which comes from that interest,
hmm
and yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
yeah. So
All right, well, I feel like that was sort of succinct.
yeah.
It went a lot longer than I expected to, but that's all right. Um, Thank you for sticking with us, and I hope you learned something.
Yeah.
And hopefully we will be doing a lot more of these. So stick around for that.
We'll probably do another episode on more modern noise, I guess, and also all sorts of other genres. This is all about just experimental music, and yeah, all sorts of things like that. So stick
All
around.
right. Yep. Have a good one, everyone.